ordinance is already being proposed and, needs to be stopped or withdrawn, that are not accurate. So again, I just think it's important to talk about what's true and what's not true, especially in today's climate where those lines are blurring. But all of the concerns are useful. And again, we've heard comments and feedback on parts of this ordinance that we weren't even paying attention to because again, they were already there, but that people feel like need to be changed.
What other thoughts or comments? Oh, go ahead, Catherine.
Elaborate on that of the parts that were already there that people are talking about changing?
Tina, do you want to share some of the, maybe that would be helpful also to sort of jumpstart the conversation, just some of the feedback we've heard so far that we're considering and taking to the police as we talk about this?
Yeah, I think the big concern is the part of the code or the draft, I should say, that talks about it being unlawful to attend a public assembly that's unpermitted. And then if you read down to the end of the ordinance, it says that any violation of this code is a misdemeanor. We're discussing that with the police department. We're actively working on getting that out of it. There's also we're concerned about the 7-day notice. Again, we will be looking at that and maybe making it what's the word? Like a may, or we're requested to. And it simply helps the police department plan for, counter protesters, traffic. They're trying to keep protesters safe. But I agree with the comments that we've heard that, should something happen, like for instance, with the federal trial going on downtown right now, people have the right to assemble immediately, and they obviously can't give a 7-day notice for something that just happens. So we want to make that change. There's another piece of the code, or I keep saying code, I mean draft, that's towards the end that regulates conduct, and it a number of people have mentioned that it includes noisy and boisterous conduct. We're also planning or working to remove that. Apparently that entire definition is the state definition of disorderly conduct, which is why it was entered at that language. We'll be looking at that as well. I know there have been concerns about the 90 days. We're in discussion about that, trying to see what we can do to make that less onerous for some of the events that are challenging to plan in that time frame. Those are the big ones that are crossing my mind right now, but there may be others that you guys are thinking of.
Any comments? I know that you all have shared some feedback with me as well, and I've passed that along. I know one bit that stands out, just kind of following up on what Tina was just saying in terms of the notice, was related to the potential addition of a late fee. And that oftentimes as organizers, you guys are up against this challenge of like, you're waiting for sponsorships to come in to know if you can afford to actually put on the event. And then you need the money to come in so that you can start planning. So just you're stuck in this kind of challenging spot of not always having the ideal timeline or amount of time that you'd like to plan events because of the sponsorship piece. And so the late fee was a challenge or just people expressed concern about that. Other things that you want to, questions that you have or concerns?
Kat, just to that point, one of the things also that I think is worth that I'm trying to keep in mind, because I completely agree. I think there's so many different kinds of events that are planned in our city. And, one of the things that's been confusing about our ordinance to date is that it's had all of these different parts of the code that have dealt with different types of events. We're trying to bring them together. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that, there's a difference between the Twin Cities Marathon and a neighborhood, festival that closes a street, a block. And there's a big difference in terms of capacity, in terms of impact on the neighborhood, and in terms of community benefit too, frankly. And so I think those concerns about, how much time in advance it's reasonable to get that information in, those, I'm really hearing you on those. That makes sense to me. Trying to balance the police department's need to be as prepared as possible to help protect those participating. And then the very, again, having worked on a district council, I know often these things are coming together at the last minute.
What were you all hoping to get answered? I mean, so you all, are there questions that you were hoping to get answered? I know that we've also have some conversations, you all have shared some feedback with me around kind of future process suggestions for processes for communicating out things like this. And I think that we'll spend some time between you and I and the district councils kind of talking through some potential ways that we could improve that in the future. But anything on that end or anything specifically related to the ordinance, proposed ordinance?
I didn't necessarily agree with questions that we were asked to come.
Jens, I can't tell if it's just quiet or if you're cutting in and out. Are you able to maybe try one more time?
Are you able to hear me better now?
It's a little bit better, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I was saying that I didn't necessarily come here with any questions that I needed answered or anything asked to come here. Are you not able to hear me? Everybody's squinting a lot. Okay.
It's hard to hear a little bit, and you cut out just the very last bit of what you were saying. I think I at least caught that you were.
Microsoft Teams is like 100% the worst platform. I have these troubles a lot. I guess I do have stuff to say, but if it's hard to hear me, I might just have to stay on mute.
You're better now, actually, Jens. That was good. That was clear.
Great. Great. I appreciate what John said about the calling this misinformation. I think that yeah, that shouldn't just pass without us taking note of that, because geez, yeah, that actually I was very offended by that. Your office sent out this draft and then put a deadline on it, right? Said that it would be on the first city council agenda of the upcoming year. So that felt like a pretty serious commitment, and also a short timeline. So we tried to make sure to get out the word. And I know that sometimes hearing challenging feedback can be tough, but I mean, that's what we all do, right? We shouldn't be worried about hearing that people disagree with us. So I mean, yeah, maybe I don't know. I think that changing your message at this point, or maybe not acknowledging that perhaps your message did sound a bit unclear, read this, it's going to be on the city council agenda in a couple weeks, and then calling it misinformation at this point. I actually don't really have a relationship with you, but it's tough to build one on this, I'd have to say. So I don't know if we're in the meeting right now to talk about that or to talk about the proposed ordinance itself. But I guess one question that I have had this whole time is specifically around, and let me lead up to this by saying that whatever is in the ordinance, it's not for if it came down to being useful, which I mean is the point, right? It's not going to be interpreted by you It's not going to be interpreted by Sarah or Robin. It's the courts, right? If somebody is charged with something, they will look to the legal language. And that's why we reached out to the ACLU to help us understand if the ways that we were reading this was accurate. And the language around specifically public assemblies. Now, I understand you couldn't give us a document that tracked those changes, but we did compare old language versus new language. And public assemblies, that definition had a couple sentences added to it, which does change what it is, which does change how a person could be, charged with a misdemeanor. And that was narrowing down the definition of public assembly. So where, it didn't have language about specifically where, it became, a public assembly is something blah, 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 that it does not block a street, a sidewalk, an alley, or movement. And I would like to know why that definition was changed, why those things were added, because they really do limit public assemblies as we know them. In fact, there is about 1,000 students right now marching through our district. Well, they're probably at the governor's mansion by now, but we fully support everything that they're doing. And that is a public assembly, and that would be something that they would be required to have a 1-week permit for under the new ordinance.
Mm-hmm. So, first of all, Jens, I really appreciate the feedback, and I think we can talk about both feedback on how this was originally communicated and on the ordinance, and I really appreciate both. And I think I'm hearing you that the deadline was made it feel like there was a lot of pressure to get feedback in, and that this was going to happen no matter what. And I think that is absolutely something that we will correct for the future. I think our goal was to we've often heard from district councils that if you're not clear on your timing and your schedule, that sometimes the opportunity to give feedback is missed. And so we wanted to be open about the fact that, we were trying to get feedback by a certain point. But I hear you 100% that did not make it seem like feedback was, something that could be taken for a while and that could really affect the process. And so I think that's really helpful. The part about public assembly, I think my biggest concern does relate to the notice, as Tina mentioned, the 7 days notification, which was already in ordinance. As you've mentioned, does not make sense to me. It seems like people should be able to pour out into the streets and protest when something happens. That's the nature of demonstration. It's not something that you plan for far in advance. Tina, do you know, in terms of the sentences that Jens is talking about that were added, why those were added in, or is that something that we should find out as a question?
Yeah, I think I might be concerned because I'm looking at the previous ordinance. Basically, any special event by definition has to block a street, sidewalk, or some other public right of way. Otherwise, you don't need a permit at all. And this whole ordinance doesn't apply. So unless you're doing one of those things, you can just, if you're on a private property, if you're not blocking a street or sidewalk, you don't need to worry about anything in the current ordinance or in the draft. The public assembly definition that currently exists right at the moment does say that it's any meeting, etc., upon any street, sidewalk, or other public grounds. So I'm not sure what new language you're referring to.
It changed that to is not.
Is not.
Is not on any street. So a public assembly like we're seeing today would not be considered a public assembly under the new ordinance. That would be a full on, because it blocks they're walking through a street. So the current language says is, the new language says is not, and it's that's the flip, but it has a significant impact. And I know this for a fact because I talked to the ACLU about it, and they confirmed, yes, in a trial that would be a really big deal.
And just so that folks are following along, Alexa did put in the comments what was in those sentences and what's in currently in the code, and then what was in the proposal as well, if you'd like to see those for reference.
I'm sorry, how do I get to the comments? It's not showing me an option.
There should, oh goodness. For those of you, for somebody who's outside the city, can you see where the comments is? Because I know that my view is different.
On my screen, it looks like on the top, and if you go across the top, it's more towards the right if your screen is maximized, and there's like the icons are sort of odd. There's like, if you kind of hover over them, the first one is show participants. It's like a couple of stick people, but yeah. And then there's sort of something that looks like in a comic strip, like a speech balloon. I think that's where you click that, and then you see the chat.
I'm sorry about Microsoft Teams. It's not.
Find that, Catherine?
No, I don't have that at all. It looks completely different.
Are you on a Mac? Okay.
No, I'm on PC.
I'll email it to you quickly. I can pull it from the chat so that you can see it.
Thanks. Sorry.
Yep. No problem.
I think what would be helpful, because I must be being really dense and I'm not seeing the difference you mean, and I don't see the word is anywhere. Maybe if you could suggest a definition that would be better.
I don't think I could do that on the fly, especially.
No, I don't know.
I'm not a lawyer.
I wouldn't expect it right now. I'm just saying.
I think that would be a good thing to consult, event organizers in St. Paul on, because they think about this all the time, right? But I think simply, the language that is proposed does significantly change how this ordinance can be applied in terms of like who will become a criminal if they go to a protest, So, and especially, thinking about our students out there on the streets right now, the senior who goes to St. Paul Central, who organized this is 18. He's an event organizer who doesn't have a permit, and he's fighting for his life and the lives of his fellow students, and he would be starting out his life as an adult with like a misdemeanor on his record for standing up for this. So that's what we, worry about,
So Jens, I appreciate that, and we will take this back. The goal of this is not to restrict public assembly. If anything, it's to do the opposite. So I think I see the difference in what you're saying. I want to look at it in the context of the rest of the ordinance to see if maybe there was a reason why those words were added, but I'm not going to do anything here that makes it harder for assemblies to take place. So I appreciate you bringing this point up.
Another thing along those lines, if you could talk about the definition of the sidewalk. It seemed that there had been a change in what was being defined as public grounds and sidewalk, so that it was referring to like that it could be defined on case-by-case basis, basically. Whereas if it was an area that people regularly used, like a sidewalk, that would be regulated versus like what most people think of when they think sidewalk. And that being that actually creating greater limits to where a movement could or could not happen.
So in the definition section you're talking about?
Yes.
Tina, do you have the difference between the definitions in the two versions?
Trying to get them both open at the same time. The original, the current definition is a sidewalk is any area or way set aside or open to the general public for purposes of pedestrian traffic, whether or not it is paved. And the new ordinance says is any area or way set aside or open to the general public for purposes of pedestrian traffic, regardless of whether it is paved. So I'm trying to see if there's any difference in those two.
You put those in the chat too, Tina, just for.
Yeah, I mean, not so much that there's a difference, but that along with the other changes that are made, it could present an issue where it's like if you're walking on the grass, then that's considered a sidewalk now. Like, I mean, that was something that was brought up by someone in my transportation committee who was saying like, well then, how can you say like, no, you don't need a permit on private space, but if you're adjacent to a public space sidewalk, how does that not become wrapped into that public space then, making it that you then don't have the permit that's necessary? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so if I'm hearing you right, there's the confusing part is kind of how do you know what's an unpaved sidewalk versus just grass somewhere? Right. And then possibly restricting it more because you're saying you could make any grassy area potentially into a sidewalk that's not paved.
Right.
Okay, that's helpful. And I'm trying to think of sidewalks that aren't paved in the city, and I'm coming up blank.
But I mean, the way that has already been worded, I guess, it then, now that everybody's looking at this, then opens up the door for, okay, well then who's defining what that public versus private space is in the instance of assembly?
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. So the current definition is actually problematic here and confusing. Great.
So this ordinance draft was created by your office working with the St. Paul Police Department and the city attorney. Is that accurate? So maybe some of these small changes in language, I could believe that maybe they were not things that were presented to you as is, but were kind of raising red flags towards, different ways that the community can be policed, especially while using, their right to free speech. It would, if, as I've read that again and again, trying to understand, okay, what would a public assembly look like, right, under these definitions? Like, where could you have a public assembly? I don't know, and it would be cool to see examples of things that would be permissible under the new ordinance, because I guess the reason it's been so challenging is I actually have not been able to imagine the place. With this combination of definitions, both in sidewalk and in public assembly, it seems like most places could be places where if they weren't feeling you being there, you could be charged.
Yeah, I hear you, Jens. And as I'm reading the definition, I mean, I'm scratching my head a little bit because that does not block or interfere with the normal right-of-way movement upon city streets, sidewalks, and alleys. And again, knowing that anything that doesn't block or interfere with the normal right-of-way, this whole section doesn't apply to anyway, seems really confusing. And I'm not sure why this definition is worded this way either. So I think you're right that having some thinking about this in terms of like on the ground, what would be permissible, what would be prohibited, how is that different from what's the case now, I think is a really good way to look at this.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think the other concerning part is that changing this language was a conscious decision, and who did this? Who wanted that?
Mm-hmm. This is why feedback is so helpful.
And I just want to clarify that a public assembly is permissible on a street or sidewalk in the current code. It just needs a permit in order to do it. But like I said, that in the current draft, we're trying to ease up on that restriction. But just to clarify.
Right. I think that's why I'm trying to figure out the does not block part, because then it seems like maybe in it and often, I mean, I think as you're trying to change an entire ordinance, there's parts that get contradictory. But if we're trying to remove the requirement for a permit, I wouldn't have wanted to define this in such a way that it means there's no place where you can have a public assembly inadvertently. So I think we just need to look closer at that.
We said we were going to go to 145, but I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to ask their questions or provide their feedback. And again, I think, either to kind of process points, if you have feedback on that, and kind of how this is communicated out, or specifically, questions or comments on the draft ordinance or what's currently in ordinance.
I had one more section that had changed. What was previously section 366A.08 talks about the timeline for granting or denying an application, and says that the chief of police has to basically let the event organizers know about the permit 48 hours prior to the event. But in the new draft, in section 366B.11, it only talks about if the minimum filing period is not met, that they have to grant or deny up to the commencement of the event. So I think there's something missing about like events that do meet the minimum filing period, like letting them know 48 hours in advance. And I think it's a little concerning to have the grant or denial of a permit, even if the application is late, up until the event starts. I think there should be some kind of window, if it's 24 hours, to let event organizers know whether or not they've gotten their permit. But I think in the transition, some of that other information might just have gotten lost as well.
Thanks for that. That's a great point. Can I summarize what I've heard so far, Kat, as we get close to the last couple of minutes here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I've written down, I know China's taking notes as well, but this question that we discussed for some while about the public assembly definition, where can you have a public assembly? And then, kind of to Jen's point, really thinking about examples of where public assemblies are allowed now, where they would be under this ordinance, so that we make that really concrete, and use that to decide whether the changes make sense. Definition of sidewalk and unpaved sidewalks being a point of some confusion in the current definition and in the proposed definition. And then Alexa, what you just raised about the timeline for granting or denying, that there should be adequate notice given if you do meet the deadline, and that might have gotten lost as we were combining. And then even if you don't, that you need more than the moment that the event starts notice to know that you've been denied a permit or granted one. Did I capture what folks said accurately there? Were there other things?
I would say that I'm still concerned about how this, how the combining of this, how the change in the 90 days and some of the language around the 7-day notice really can affect how these things go. I think, what Kat was saying about the funding for certain events and things, while that's not something that the city can control necessarily, nor the planners for that matter, is there any sort of timeline for being able to pay things? And then with the addition of the late fees and kind of sorry, my brain is not working completely. Let me look my note again.
All good. It's a Tuesday.
Talking about the fees in general being, greater for these late fees, when it's also then there's no consideration then for things that would be of a community benefit that might happen on a shorter timeline, but that people in our positions often work very hard to make happen for the public, doesn't always meet that 90 days or 7 days kind of thing. And also then looking at, while yes, it's good to take into consideration, a road race versus a block party and how those have a difference in capacity and community benefit. I think also talking about a community celebration or exercise event versus a public demonstration or protest really needs some clearer thought around it, in my opinion, because it seems like where the spirit of this is coming from, aside from making it administratively easier for staff, it seems like maybe the reason there were more than one ordinance was because that allowed for flexibility in, okay, what kind of event is this? What is the situation around it? Yeah, I guess those are kind of some jumbled thoughts.
No, that's super helpful. And by the way, I think that the notice for a demonstration, I'm not comfortable with that period once that was brought to my attention. I think there's a big difference between, again, a spontaneous assembly in response to some event in our community that people want to get out and protest versus something that, has been planned in advance. And I think so we'll definitely continue to think about the 90 days and whether that makes sense for community events. Also, I think there's a communication issue here too, in terms of what notice means. Because when I talk to our police department, they've said, notice is that you're planning to do something and the date and where it's going to be, and that, all the details can kind of get worked out along the way, but just a heads up. And I think that that's much less onerous than I had originally thought when notice was mentioned. And so there's some kind of community dialogue, I think, that's needed about what really the department would need and when.
And can I just ask, and I don't expect anybody to answer it at the moment, but if you could email us, if there is a number of days you would think would be reasonable for a community event. I think part of the reason that a number of days is asked for is because the special event committee meets every month. And when they get late applications, they sometimes have to pull together, sort of ad hoc meetings very quickly. It just complicates the planning on the city side because it involves 7 or 8 different departments have to meet to figure out an event. So if you had some feedback about that, that would be great.
And again, Tina, this is only for events that close streets.
Yeah, this is the current ordinance and the proposed ordinance only apply to anything that would close a street or sidewalk or some other public right of way, which I'm not sure what that would be.
And one other question as far as the process in, like, obviously there's drafting happening and all of that, but I'm wondering where, like, what next steps look like and if there's going to be greater effort for some community engagement in this.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So we are having conversations like this one and receiving emails and sort of collating all the feedback that we're receiving. We've already had one meeting with the police department to push some of the questions that we've gotten and try to figure out how to resolve those issues. We have another one scheduled. We wanted to wait until we'd had this conversation to work through these concerns. My expectation would be that we'll send out communication to everybody once we have a draft that incorporates revisions that's really clear as to what changes were made in response to the feedback we received, and if changes weren't made, why that was. Just kind of summarizes what we heard and what we did in response. And then, I think there would be, depending on kind of what folks' response to that is, we may need to do additional community engagement, or at that point, we might be ready to just propose the ordinance and then have the normal community engagement public hearing process that moves forward there. But I would expect that we're, at least a few weeks of additional listening and revision before we'd have a new draft ready to share. How does that sound to you?
That sounds good. I would just say that, once we receive some kind of new draft, it generally takes the 30 to 45 day cycle for us to bring that to committees and the board. So just, being given enough time to do, engagement on our end so that we can come back with feedback from the community, as much time as possible, but definitely at least that 30 to 45 days.
And I think something that I heard and just kind of want to echo along those same lines is just the desire from all of you as district councils to really, the community engagement and kind of gathering that feedback is a really important piece of what you all do, and you take it very seriously. And so really being able to, giving you enough time to do that allows you to kind of effectively engage in the process. And so that's really where the push for that timeline, that 30 to 45 day feedback place time comes from. So I thought somebody made that point to me, and I just think it's an important one that I wanted to highlight. Any other, we're a little over time here, so I want to be respectful of time, but any other final comments at all?
Will the recording of this meeting be made available to us?
Yep.
Great, thanks. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Chevy.
Wonderful. Well, and I know that you all have your EDCO meeting and stuff coming up, and so I just say, if you as a group are talking about this again and you have additional feedback or questions, obviously I'm sure Councilmember Naker would probably say this, but I'll just say too, just don't hesitate to reach out to me with questions, and I'm happy to help facilitate getting answers, or obviously reaching out directly to Councilmember Naker and Tina with that feedback or any questions. And thank you for the time. So
thank you so much. This has been really, really, really productive. We appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Catherine, if you have a minute, can you stay on for just 30 seconds?
Yeah.
Or actually, I guess I can just ask you right now. Bye. Thank you. I just need to run and grab some caffeine.